Welcome, Poirot Tales. Chapter 1. The Corridor. That lied, the Blackridge building was one of those grave old London addresses that seemed to distrust sunlight. Even by afternoon its facade held a chill reserve, as though the stone had been laid not to welcome life, but to regulate it. By night it became sterner still. The lamps in the vestibule cast a pale, insufficient glow over the marble floor, and the long corridor on the second story shone with a polished whiteness that gave back every sound with unnatural emphasis. A footstep there did not merely fall, it returned, prolonged and altered, as though the building had taken it upon itself to edit the truth before releasing it again. On the night of Silas Mercer's death, that corridor had done exactly that. Was present when Inspector Hale sent for Hercule Poirot. Hale was an honest man with a square jaw, a practical intelligence, and a stubborn faith in witness statements. On ordinary days, these qualities served him well. That evening, they had all been badly shaken. By the time Poirot arrived, 3 persons in the building had given accounts of the footsteps heard after the fatal cry, and all 3, though equally convinced, had managed to disagree in a fashion that made certainty look almost indecent. 2. Witnesses swore the running steps fled toward the eastern stair. A third insisted, with affronted confidence, that they had rushed in the opposite direction, toward the western lift. All 3 had heard motion. All 3 could not be right. Miss Hensley. The dead man was Silas Mercer, owner of the Blackridge building, collector of rents, favors, humiliations, and enemies. He lay in his private office with a terrible head wound. Nearby lay a heavy bronze paperweight in the shape of a crouching lion, stained with blood and too ready to look like the weapon. Nothing appeared stolen. The office windows were locked from within. No sign of forced entry showed at the door. The only obvious route in or out was the marble corridor itself, now crowded with constables, residents in dressing gowns, and theories. Poirot arrived without hurry. That, I think, was the first useful thing he did. Panic has a way of multiplying when it is answered in its own tone. He came in carrying no more than gloves, a notebook, and that faint expression of distaste he always wore when entering a room already full of other people's bad thinking. He did not ask at once to see the body. He did not demand the weapon. He stood at the office door, listened to the corridor in silence, and then said in his mild voice, "Before we discuss who ran, might we establish whether anyone truly ran at all?" That was the first moment the case began to move away from noise and toward intelligence. Hale, who had been ready with Times statements and floor plans, gave him a look I knew well. It was the look of a man uncertain whether he was being enlightened or obstructed. "There were footsteps," he said. 3 people heard them. "Yes," said Poirot, "but what one hears in a marble passage is not always what happened in it. Tell me where each witness stood." We began at once. The first witness was Miss Elspeth Drew, Mercer's secretary, who was in the outer room nearest the eastern side of the office. She said she had been in the outer room at the sound of raised voices from Mercer's office. A second later came a heavy crash, then a cry from the secretary's room, and then running footsteps that passed along the corridor toward the east. They were quick, she said. "Quite quick. A man in a panic, I should say," Poirot asked. "Did you see anyone?" "No, I remained near the outer room door. But I heard it distinctly." "Him?" "Well, someone." "Ah, that is better." The second witness, Edwin Pike, a retired schoolmaster of violent certainty and failing hearing, occupied a corner suite nearer the middle of the passage. He declared that the runner had gone east as well, though he added several details so improbable that even Hale had the grace to look embarrassed while they were repeated. The footsteps, according to the Major, were hesitating but rapid, light but unmistakably male, and accompanied by the sort of breathing one hears in a coward. "How," asked Poirot pleasantly, "did you distinguish the breathing of a coward from that of a citizen in haste?" The Major, missing the tone entirely, replied, "Experience." The third witness was Mrs. Cora Bell, the night porter, with a large confidence in his own perceptions. She lived near the western Endon insisted the steps had come toward the lift, not away from it. She had even opened her door wide enough to feel the draft of movement. "Someone seemed to fly past," she said. "I would swear to it." "Did you see the person?" "No. But the sound was on top of me." Poirot nodded and said no more. When the statements had been heard again in their proper places, he asked that everyone except Hale and myself step back from the corridor. Then he stood in the exact center of the passage, looking first east, then west, then up at the ceiling where the electric globes burned at intervals in tarnished brass brackets. "It is a most accomplished liar," he said. "The corridor?" I asked. "Yes. Observe the proportions. Hard floor, hard walls, high ceiling, long uninterrupted length, and doorways set at regular intervals. Sound does not travel here. It ricochets. A running step may seem ahead when it is behind. One sharp. Impact may become several. Panic hears direction only after fear has already chosen one." Hale crossed his arms. "You mean every witness may be mistaken?" "No. I mean each may be sincerely faithful to a false impression. That is much more dangerous." Only then did Poirot enter Mercer's office. Silas Mercer lay beside his writing table on one knee and shoulder, as though he had half risen before the second blow, or perhaps had tried to turn. The lion paperweight rested nearby with a dark stain at one edge. The room itself was almost offensively orderly. Ledgers stacked square, correspondence tray aligned, fire low but tidy, curtains half drawn, and on the desk a silver pencil laid exactly parallel to the blotter. Such order after violence always has one of two meanings. Either the victim was a man who arranged things fanatically, or the killer paused to avoid disturbing what mattered. Sometimes both are true. Mercer was a large man, heavy in face and chest, with that prosperous coarseness which suggests appetite disciplined only by calculation. In life, I thought, he must have been formidable chiefly to those dependent upon him. In death, he looked surprised that any hand in the world had dared treat him as interruptible. His secretary, Nora Hensley, sat in the outer room under a constable's supervision, white and trembling but not hysterical. She stated that Mercer had kept her late to finish letters, that a visitor had not been announced, and that at approximately 5 minutes to 10 she heard her employer raise his voice sharply, though she could not distinguish the words. Immediately afterward came the crash, then silence, then what she thought were running steps in the corridor. "And you did not enter at once?" asked Poirot. "I was frightened, quite naturally." "Then what?" "I opened the door. He was on the floor. The paperweight was near him. I screamed. And the footsteps? They came just as I screamed, or just after. I can't say." Poirot's eyes sharpened. That uncertainty, I knew, interested him far more than any certainty in the corridor. "Miss Hensley," he said gently, "before tonight, had Mr. Mercer expected trouble?" She hesitated. He expected many things. He trusted almost no one. Did he have enemies? A faint, miserable smile crossed her face. He made them industriously. That also was useful. There were, it appeared, several tenants with grievances. Mercer owned not only the building, but a series of loans and side obligations by which he extended his power beyond rent. He kept promissory notes, delayed repairs strategically, and knew more than was healthy about the private embarrassments of those who depended on him. In short, he was precisely the sort of man whose death produces not grief, but inventory. Poirot examined the windows next, locked indeed, and solidly. The fireplace, too narrow for passage, the desk drawers closed, nothing overturned except the chair nearest the body, yet at the edge of the carpet, where it met the marble threshold, he stopped and bent very low. "What is it?" said Hale. "A pause," said Poirot. "I saw nothing." He pointed. There, faintly visible where the corridor light struck sideways, was a dull smear upon the polished stone just outside the office. Not the tread of a running foot, but the small crescent drag made when rubber meets marble and checks itself abruptly. "Someone halted here," said Poirot. "Or turned, not at full speed, at decision." Hale looked unconvinced. "A constable might have done it after the fact." Of course. But then why only one mark? No. Somebody stood at this door, entered, or meant to enter, and adjusted in tension. At the threshold, he straightened and glanced down the corridor once more. "My friend," he said to me, "the building has not merely reflected sound. It has improved it. There may have been one step, one cry, one door, and already we have a running fugitive in 3 directions. The body itself yielded little immediately beyond the obvious violence, but Mercer's right cuff was torn at the button and one fingernail showed a trace of dark fabric caught beneath it. Poirot stored that without comment. More interesting still was the desk blotter. Upon it, half hidden beneath a sheaf of typed notices, lay an impression where a small rectangular object had recently rested and been removed. "A card case?" I suggested. "Perhaps. Or a memorandum book. Something private enough to be taken and common enough not to be noticed missing at once. Then something was stolen after all." Poirot shook his head. "No, something was removed. Theft is a motive. Removal is a method." By the time he had finished the first examination, the corridor already seemed a different place to me. Not a route of escape, but a stage on which frightened ears had invented one. Whatever happened at Blackridge, the footsteps were not yet to be trusted. And if they were not, then the murderer might still belong not to some fleeing figure glimpsed in panic, but to the quieter circle of people already standing under the corridor lamps, insisting they had heard what could not be true. That, I think, was the true beginning of the case. Not the blow nor the cry, but the discovery that the corridor itself had lied, and that all who repeated its story had, quite innocently, begun to lie for it. Chapter 2. The Witnesses of Sound. There were 4 principal witnesses connected with the second floor that night, though only 3 claimed to have heard the fleeing steps clearly. Poirot remarked at once that this was already encouraging. When many people hear the same thing, one often gets panic. When they hear it differently, one at least gets structure. "The trouble with sound, Hastings," he said as we stood in the passage outside Silas Mercer's office, "is that it has no face. People supply one afterward and call that memory. Inspector Hale, who had by then recovered enough of his professional balance to resent aphorisms, replied that in his experience the quickest road to truth lay in taking statements before the imagination had time to improve them. "Certainly," said Poirot. "Only one must also know what imagination prefers to improve. Most commonly, it improves certainty." The first witness was Nora Hensley, Mercer's secretary. She sat in the small outer room beyond the office, pale and rigid in the hard chair. The constables had given her, with the strained posture of a woman who had learned to survive by anticipating temper. One saw at once that nerves, in her, were not a fashionable ailment, but a working condition. Her gloves lay folded on her lap. She had twisted one thumb button half loose without, I think, realizing it. When Poirot introduced himself, she did not ask whether he believed her. That in itself recommended her. "You were with Mr. Mercer this evening?" "Yes." "Until when?" "Until 8:15, perhaps a little after." Hale interjected that she had already given the time as about 8:15, and Poirot inclined his head as though this supported rather than corrected him. "Times," he said kindly, "are like dress hems. Women often know them more accurately than men think." Miss Hensley gave him the faintest of surprised looks and continued. She had spent the early evening typing letters and checking rents for the coming quarter. Mercer had been in a black mood from 7 onward, which, from the weary manner of her saying it, seemed not unusual. At about 8:10, the house telephone rang. He answered it himself, spoke briefly, and then told her she might leave the inner office but remain in the outer room in case he required copying done later. "A visitor?" asked Poirot. He did not say, but I assumed as much. "You heard someone arrive?" "Not clearly. The corridor carries sound so oddly. But I knew someone had come because Mr. Mercer began using the tone he reserved for people he meant to overpower." That was a fine observation, and Poirot valued it. "You heard raised voices?" "Yes." "Could you distinguish the second voice?" "No. Only that it was lower." "Male?" She hesitated. I thought so then. And now? She looked at him directly for the first time. Now I am less certain of everything I heard in that corridor. Poirot smiled very slightly. Excellent. You are already more useful than most. She said that several minutes after Mercer's visitor had entered, the voices sharpened. One sentence from Mercer came through very distinctly. You have no claim here. There followed a pause, then another burst of speech she could not separate into words. Then, according to her first version, came the unmistakable sound of a man running east. Poirot did not challenge the phrase at once. He asked instead what made the sound unmistakable. She frowned. It was quick, hard, receding. Toward the eastern stair because you heard it grow fainter in that direction. Yes. Or because you expected flight away from the office to move east. That touched her visibly. I don't know. Quite. And did you hear the office door? Close or open? I heard a sharp sound. I thought it was the door. Before or after the footsteps, her mouth tightened. I believed after. But now I cannot swear to it. Hale made a note with some displeasure. He liked witnesses to improve in precision, not humility. Poirot, on the contrary, seemed positively cheered. When we left her, he said to me in the passage, Miss Hensley has suffered enough from Mr. Mercer to prefer accuracy over drama. That is rare. She may still be mistaken, but she will not decorate. The second witness was Edwin Pike, a retired schoolmaster who occupied a suite opposite the records room. He received us in a dressing gown of punitive neatness, spectacles, perched low on the nose, and an expression of thin indignation with the world for having required him to repeat himself to men less orderly than he deserved. He had already told Hale that the runner fled west, not east, and now repeated it with a kind of pedagogic firmness that suggested contradiction was not merely error, but bad manners. The steps, he said, were distinct. Westward, I should say toward the lift. You did not see the person? No. I heard sufficiently. And you are quite sure? Yes. Poirot wandered gently about the room while Mr. Pike spoke. The suite door stood opposite the records room, a little west of Mercer's office. From there the corridor bent just enough to alter echo and conceal direct sight. Poirot glanced once at the polished floor, the high plaster ceiling, the brass umbrella stand, and the old man's slippers lined side by side like pupils under inspection. You added, said Poirot, that the steps were uneven. Mr. Pike's face sharpened with remembered triumph. Indeed, as though the runner favored one leg. That is an unusual precision. It is called listening. Hale shifted, irritated. Poirot asked, would you describe it? Left, right, pause. Left, right, pause. Not a true limp, but an inequality. You have known men with lameness? I taught boys for 36 years. They run injured, pretending not to. It produces a rhythm. This was plausible. Yet Poirot did not seem satisfied. Did the steps diminish into distance? No, they broke off. Where? I cannot say. Near the lift, perhaps. There was confusion afterward. And what were you doing when you heard them? Pike straightened. Reading. What? The Quarterly Review. Poirot took from the side table the issue in question. A ribbon marked a page 3/4 of the way through. You had been seated? Yes. Then, Monsieur Pike, forgive me, but how did you distinguish left leg from right, so certainly from a seated position behind a half-open door in a corridor of echoing marble? The retired schoolmaster colored. I said I should say the runner favored one leg. Ah. There is a difference between what one hears and what one later deduces. We must not punish the sound for the cleverness added afterward. It was a neat little thrust. Pike bridled at once. I know what I heard. Yes, said Poirot, but you also know what you wish to be known to have heard clearly. That is another matter. When we were outside again, Hale said, he's insufferable, but probably honest. Probably, said Poirot. He hears west because he lives west. He adds the limp because it flatters his discernment, Such men improve evidence as schoolmasters, improve essays. The third witness was Martin Bell, the night porter. He had been downstairs near the lobby desk at the time of the murder and, unlike the others, heard the disturbance through the stairwell rather than the corridor itself. Bell was a compact, reliable-looking man in his 40s with broad hands, a thinning head of hair, and the permanent expression of one accustomed to apologizing for things beyond his control. Drafts, delayed lifts, dripping umbrellas, and the moral quality of tenants. He greeted Hale with the anxious loyalty of subordinate authority. "I heard the cry clear enough," he said. Then steps racing for the east stairs. "From the second floor?" "Yes, sir." "How can you tell?" "They came down toward me, or so it seemed." Poirot asked him to demonstrate where he stood. Bell did so, placing himself by the lobby ledger with the marble stair, rising in a square well above. The acoustics there were extraordinary. A dropped key from the landing sounded almost at one's shoulder. A cough on the first-floor turn seemed to come from below. Poirot clapped once very softly, and the building returned him 3 answers. "When were the floors polished?" he asked. "This afternoon, sir. Full wax on the 2nd and 3rd. "Does that alter sound?" Bell hesitated, then admitted what perhaps he had not wished to put into his first statement. "The marble passage often tosses sound down strangely after polishing. Especially if the air is damp. You'll hear steps where there are none, or think someone's coming down when they've only turned on the landing." "There," said Poirot to me when Bell had finished. "The building itself confesses." Bell, now less certain than before, added that he heard what he took for speed, but could not swear whether the runner reached the stairs or only approached them. "That," said Poirot, "is already much better." The fourth witness had heard no footsteps distinctly at all, which made him, in Poirot's view, immediately interesting. Dr. Calvin Rusk, a tenant on the floor above, was a spare, dark man with good hands and the calm manner of one long accustomed to people in pain. He had heard Mercer shout from below, heard it, he said, through the floor vent in his consultation. "Room, as you will not ruin me," followed by a heavy crash. He came down at once and reached the second floor moments later to find the office door ajar, Nora Hensley screaming, and the corridor already thick with confusion. "No footsteps?" asked Poirot. "Not that I could distinguish. Yet others insist they heard a runner." Rusk gave a small shrug. "In buildings like this, what one hears depends as much on where one stands as on what occurs." Poirot liked that answer. So did I. Dr. Rusk then supplied another important detail. Mercer had been under considerable pressure in recent weeks, though he had concealed it beneath his usual bullying confidence. He drank more. He quarreled on the telephone. He had even once asked Rusk, half in jest and half in nerves, whether severe agitation could produce an apoplectic seizure before a debt had technically come due. "A joke?" I said. Rusk looked at me. Mercer made jokes the way other men brandished paper knives. That seemed an admirable description of the dead. Man Poirot questioned each witness not like a policeman collecting statements, but like a surgeon testing pain. He noted not only what they said, but when they hesitated, which details came too quickly, what parts had hardened through repetition, and which phrases sounded as if first composed silently before ever being spoken aloud. That evening, when we were alone for a moment in Mercer's office, he said, "People lie more readily about certainty than about events. It flatters them to have heard clearly." He stood again at the threshold and looked out into the corridor. Miss Hensley heard conflict, and then what she believed was flight. Pike heard a direction and added scholarship. Bell heard the building's echo through the stairwell and mistook movement for descent. Dr. Rusk heard only the one thing likely to be true because it was attached to language, not geometry. "You will not ruin me." So no one ran. Poirot turned his head. "My dear Hastings, someone may have run. But if we begin by believing in the runner, then the corridor leads the investigation. I prefer first to know whether the corridor deserves such authority." He then asked a question Hale had not yet properly considered. Who benefited first from the belief that a murderer fled immediately along the corridor? I thought at once of the tenants, any suspect who remained on the floor. Precisely. A running fugitive is wonderfully convenient for the stationary liar. That, I felt, was the true significance of the witness statements. Not that they contradicted one another, but that together they had created a phantom escape route for someone who may never have fled at all. If the building magnified sound, then a door slammed, a dropped object, or a few hurried steps within the office might easily have been translated by frightened ears into a full pursuit scene outside. And once such a scene existed in the minds of the witnesses, the murderer, if still close at hand, was instantly granted something precious. Distance. That was, I think, the moment the case took on its proper shape. We were no longer seeking only a killer. We were seeking the person who most needed the corridor to lie on his behalf. Chapter 3. The dead man's circle, Silas Mercer, had made a career of placing his hand upon the weak point in other men's lives. He lent money, but never merely money. He held leases, but never merely property. He bought secrets, encouraged dependencies, and treated obligation as a form of ownership. Such men are seldom mourned with purity. They are merely endured while alive, and afterward survived, as one survives a season of foul weather. By midnight, Inspector Hale had assembled a small circle of persons with motive enough to populate a courtroom and temper enough to improve it. Poirot listened to the list without visible excitement. That, I have observed, is always a bad sign for the obvious suspect. When other men hear of debts, quarrels, threatened dismissals, and extortionate rents, they feel the agreeable warmth of options. Poirot, on the contrary, becomes cooler. A crowd of motives never impressed him. It was, he said, not abundance but confusion. Too many reasons to kill usually mean that reason alone will not separate the hand from the desire. There was, said Hale, consulting his notebook, Nora Hensley, the secretary, who had served Mercer for 8 years and knew the habits of his business better than any accountant. She admitted that he had threatened to dismiss her last week after accusing her of copying private letters. Poirot nodded, but said nothing. Hale continued. Dr. Calvin Rusk, whose medical practice has been declining. Mercer held 2 notes against him and had pressed for repayment. Edwin Pike, the retired schoolmaster, was fighting a rent increase that would have forced him from the building within the month, and Jasper Reed, a contractor, arrived this evening for a private appointment and now claims he left before the murder. Already, murmured Poirot, we have enough grievance for an election. Jasper Reed was brought in first. He was a broad-shouldered man of perhaps 45, well-dressed in the prosperous modern style, and carrying himself with the polished assurance of one used to negotiating disagreement into profit. Yet behind that polish lay something harder. He had the look of a man who expects respect because he has fought for it and is deeply offended when respect is delayed. His injured dignity came too readily. That, I thought, was either innocence under strain or guilt dressed for business. Reed admitted at once that he had quarreled with Mercer. The dispute concerned a city renovation contract in which, according to him, Mercer had discovered a defect and proposed to make silence available for a price. He tried to extort me, Reed said coldly. There is no need to soften the term. And, you refused, asked Poirot. I objected to being handled like a tenant. Mercer believed everyone had a private fear available for purchase. That belief, said Poirot, is often fatal. Reed's mouth tightened. He stated that the discussion had indeed become heated, but not violent. Mercer, he said, had threatened civil action and hinted at worse. Reed had then left by the western lift, while Mercer remained very much alive behind his desk. You are sure of the lift? Said Poirot. Yes. Did anyone see you use it? The liftman had gone. It was self-operated at that hour. Nora Hensley says she did not see you leave. She was in the outer room with her back to the corridor. That is possible, said Poirot, yet curious. A broad-shouldered man with injured dignity often occupies more space in departure than in arrival. Reed did not enjoy that. Nora Hensley came next, and with her the room grew less theatrical and more human. She admitted that Mercer had threatened her position after accusing her of copying letters. He believed, she said, that everyone around him either stole, listened, or both. "Did you?" asked Hale bluntly. "No." Poirot intervened before the inspector could flatten her with practicality. "What sort of letters?" "Private matters, tenants, debts, some personal." "Blackmail?" She hesitated. "Not in the written sense, but he liked to keep enough, in reserve, that people behaved." "Were you afraid of him?" "Yes." "Did you wish him dead?" At that she looked almost offended. "I wished him absent." "That is not the same thing." A fine answer. Poirot approved of it. Dr. Rusk proved as calm under scrutiny as he had upstairs, though I thought his restraint less effortless now. He did indeed owe Mercer money. Yes, Mercer had pressed him. Yes, the pressure had recently grown sharper. But Rusk met the suggestion of murder with tired disgust rather than fear. "Mercer knew enough of my affairs to make life tedious," he said. "He did not know enough to make murder economical." "Economical," said Poirot. "If I killed every creditor who embarrassed me, I should soon exhaust both my practice and my evenings." Edwin Pike, when recalled, was less dignified than before. The rent increase had, it seemed, genuinely driven him toward desperation. And desperation in retired schoolmasters produces not violence so much as moral outrage sharpened into a weapon. He denounced Mercer's methods, the decline of standards, modern commercial brutality, and the scandal of turning old tenants into merchandise. Yet, for all his anger, he did not strike me as a man who could deliver a fatal blow with a bronze lion unless first provided with a full argument and 15 minutes' notice. Poirot, having heard all this, arranged the motives, as he later described it, like pieces on a shelf, and then stood back from them. Every one of them had reason. "To wish Mercer dead," he said. "That is a fog, not a map." Hale frowned. "Fog, perhaps, but thick enough to work in." "Yes," said Poirot, "which is exactly why one must not begin there. Motive tells us who could have killed. It does not tell us who understood the setting well enough to trust it." "The setting?" "The corridor, my friend. The corridor and its lie." He then asked what seemed, to Hale at least, an almost childish irrelevance. "Who ordered the floors polished this afternoon?" Bell, the night porter, supplied the answer. Mercer himself had insisted on it. Prospective investors were expected the next day, and the marble was to shine. It had been waxed to a hard brilliance by men from the cleaning firm and left afterward, as slippery to the ear as to the shoe. Poirot's eyes brightened at once. Aha! He went out into the passage, bent, and studied the floor beneath the electric lamps. To me it remained simply marble, pale, immaculate, and much too reflective. For comfort. To him it had become an instrument. "You see, Hastings, a hard waxed surface alters not merely the tread, but the report of the tread. It sharpens, lengthens, and throws it. Also," he pointed, "it preserves almost nothing unless the foot is wet, dirty, or checks itself abruptly. A murderer who knew the floors had been newly polished might trust the corridor far more than one walking on carpet." Hale joined us reluctantly. "You mean someone planned around acoustics?" "I mean someone understood advantage when he heard it. Perhaps planned, perhaps seized. But yes, the corridor tonight was not neutral. It was prepared, though innocently, to become a false witness. That observation shifted the entire perspective of the case. Up to then, the suspects had been those with quarrels, debts, and resentments. Now there entered another criterion: familiarity with the building. Who knew how sound behaved in that passage? Who knew the west lift, the east stair, the records room recess, the exact places where an office door half opened would release noise and multiply it? Not every enemy of Mercer possessed such intimacy. Reed, for instance, had been a visitor. He may have quarreled, may even have killed, but would he stake his safety on the corridor's ability to contradict itself? Dr. Rusk, living above, knew the building's voice perhaps better than most. Nora Hensley, working there daily, certainly did. Pike and Bell knew it through long residence and routine. Suddenly motive no longer led alone. It had to walk arm in arm with architectural knowledge. "Now," said Poirot very softly, "we begin to ask the useful question, not who hated Mercer, but who could stand close by after the blow and rely on the building to create a fugitive for him." I felt then, with that peculiar excitement only Poirot ever produced in me, that the case had deepened from mere murder into design. Mercer's circle of enemies was large, but the dead man's true circle, the one that mattered, would be the smaller ring of those who understood not simply his weaknesses, but the corridors. And somewhere within that narrower circumference, I thought, stood the person who had trusted Marble, Echo, and Panic to carry him farther than his feet ever did. Chapter 4. The Science of Echoes, at 10. The following morning, Hercule Poirot requested that the second floor be cleared. Inspector Hale, though sceptical, complied, with the reluctant air of a practical man, consenting to what he believes will prove an elegant waste of police time. The tenants were kept below stairs, the constables withdrawn to either end of the passage, and the doors along the corridor closed as they had been on the previous evening so far as memory and habit could restore them. The morning light fell coldly through the stairwell glass, and the long marble floor of the second story shone with such reproachful innocence that one might have thought it incapable of falsehood. Poirot regarded it as one might regard a witness, of excellent address and dubious morals. "You see, Hastings," he said, standing in the middle of the passage with his head slightly inclined, "a lie told by a person is common. A lie told by architecture is much more dangerous because everybody trusts it at first." The corridor, now emptied of agitation, seemed even longer than the night before. Pale marble underfoot, high panelled walls on either side, narrow mouldings, and a ceiling so slightly arched that the eye barely noticed it, while the ear obeyed it entirely. These elements together produced not grandeur, but a peculiar acoustic vanity. A sound born there did not remain itself. It lengthened, flattened, doubled, and returned as something almost but not quite the same. Hale folded his arms. "You mean to prove my witnesses all wrong?" "No," said Poirot. "I mean to prove that they were wrong honestly. After that, perhaps, we may look for the person wrong dishonestly." He arranged the experiment with extraordinary care. First he had Bell, the night porter, stand near Mercer's office door, while Poirot himself took position by Miss Hensley's room toward the eastern end. Bell was instructed to walk, then run, then merely stamp twice and stop. Each sound was repeated with the corridor doors alternately open and closed. Then Edwin Pike was placed farther west with his cane, which he was told to set down sharply, at measured intervals while Hale and I listened from the eastern stairhead. Finally, Poirot instructed me, rather to my indignation, to strike the wall panels at irregular points with my knuckles, while he moved from door to door like a music master, testing a room for resonance. The results were astonishing only because no one had thought to be astonished sooner. A rapid movement near Mercer's office seemed, from Miss Hensley's side, to travel westward. The same sound, heard from the stairwell below, appeared to rush east. A hard check of the foot, when the waxed marble answered it sharply, became to the hearer 2 or 3 diminishing steps in succession. Bell's ordinary run, begun near the office and stopped after only a few yards, sounded to Hale from the lobby landing like a full retreat toward the stairs. My blows on the panels, absurd as they felt to perform, leapt across the corridor and returned from behind in such a way that Pike, listening with injured dignity near the records room, insisted twice that someone had passed him when no one had moved at all. Poirot permitted himself the smallest smile. "Hard surfaces," he said, "make dishonest witnesses." He then refined the test still further. "Now," he said, "let us reproduce Panic." He made Bell stand just outside Mercer's office threshold. The porter was instructed to open the door sharply, stamp twice with force upon the marble, pause, and then slap the panelling once with his palm. Poirot took Hale to the eastern end, placed me halfway toward the lift, and stationed Pike near his own suite. Bell obeyed. The effect was unnerving. From where I stood, the first stamp seemed close, the second already more distant, and the blow on the wall might very easily have passed for a body or shoulder, striking the panelling in flight. Hale, from the east, swore under his breath, and turned westward. Pike, when asked afterward what he had heard, declared with moral certainty that someone had run toward the eastern stair, faltered, and then altered course. "But no one moved more than a yard," said Poirot. The retired schoolmaster coloured, angrily. "Then the building is a fraud." "No," said Poirot, "merely a collaborator." More curious still, Poirot found that a person starting near Mercer's door and stamping twice at the right intervals could create the convincing illusion of retreating footsteps without crossing half the passage. The marble took the first blow and threw it outward. The second, placed a shade farther back and slightly angled, arrived at the listening ear as continuation rather than repetition. Add to that a door edge moving, a wall strike, or the cry of a shocked secretary, and the corridor supplied the rest with indecent generosity. "Sound," said Poirot, "has no conscience. It goes wherever shape sends it. Panic then gives it narrative." He had Bell perform the same brief stamping trick, while Miss Hensley herself, recalled now to listen from the outer office, stood pale in the doorway. When it was done, she put a hand to her throat. "That is it," she said. "Or near enough. I would have sworn someone was gone." "Yes," said Poirot gently. "You swore to a retreat because the corridor gave you one, and fear made it convincing." Hale rubbed his chin and frowned at the passage as if it had personally insulted him. "So none of them knows what direction the killer ran." "Perhaps," said Poirot. "Or perhaps one of them knows precisely that there was no such running because he manufactured the effect." That changed the case entirely. Hale saw it at once, though reluctantly. Up to then, the investigation had still in his mind been governed by the image of a fleeing murderer, a man striking Mercer, dashing from the office, and relying on speed before the cry raised the building. But if the running was a phantom, born of acoustics and expectation, then the killer need never have fled the way everyone assumed. He might have remained close to the office. He might have stepped into some nearby doorway. He might even have walked out calmly a minute later, while the witnesses, each faithful to the corridor's lie, searched mentally for a runner who had never existed. Poirot said as much. The false fugitive is a most useful accomplice. He gives distance to the murderer before time has actually passed. Everyone looks down the passage. No one looks at the person standing still. Hale turned. "Toward Mercer's office. Then the killer may have been one of the people who afterward helped raise the alarm. Yes? Or one of the witnesses. Yes?" That was the hardest part for him. Policemen, like most men, dislike being told that the witness and the suspect may occupy the same body. It offends their taste for arrangement. Poirot then asked, a question no one had yet put plainly enough. Who knew the corridor well enough to trust it with a lie? The answers narrowed at once. Not Jasper Reed, perhaps, unless he had visited often enough to learn the building's voice. Not some outside assassin, unless exceptionally lucky. But Nora Hensley, yes. Pike, certainly. Bell, without question. Dr. Rusk from the floor above, perhaps less through the passage than through the stairwell acoustics. Mercer himself, had he lived, would have known. That meant the building's deceit favored not strangers, but intimates. He made one final experiment before pronouncing himself satisfied. This time, he stood just inside Mercer's office door and asked me to remain in the corridor with Hale. He closed the door almost entirely, then from within gave one sudden blow upon the panel with the bronze paperweight wrapped in a cloth, followed instantly by 2 hard stamps near the threshold and a scraping movement of chair leg across carpet. I jumped. Hale swore again. To both of us it sounded very like a struggle followed by retreat. Poirot opened the door at once. "You see," he said, "the corridor needs very little to begin inventing for us." He returned the paperweight to the desk and brushed an imaginary speck from his sleeve. "Panic," he said, "is the accomplice of acoustics." No truer sentence was spoken in the case. The scientific point, as he later explained it to me over coffee in Mercer's outer room, was simple enough in principle and treacherous in effect. The polished marble reflected high, sharp impacts. The panelled walls absorbed less than plaster would have done and returned sound laterally. The slight ceiling arch gathered and redirected what the floor threw upward. A person near the center of the corridor produced echoes that shifted apparent direction depending on the listener's position. A person below in the stairwell heard movement translated vertically and therefore misleadingly eastward. A person west of the source might hear the second reflection before the first settled. The newly waxed floor made the whole performance brighter and harder, as though each footfall had been sharpened with a knife. "Buildings," said Poirot, "have characters. Blackridge has vanity. It cannot resist repeating itself." By the end of the hour, even Hale was convinced. Then, "We have no runner," he said. "We have," Poirot corrected him, "no reliable proof of a runner. That is different, and much better. Now the time of the crime collapses inward. The murderer may have been near the office after the cry. He may have opened the door himself. He may have joined the confusion at once." Hale looked slowly down the corridor, now robbed of its false certainty. The place seemed changed. Yesterday it had been a route. Today it was an instrument. Not a passage along which truth traveled, but a polished machine for turning impacts into misinformation. "And the witnesses?" I asked. Poirot shrugged lightly. "We keep them all. But we no longer ask what direction they heard. We ask instead, who among them showed too much confidence in a thing no human ear had a right to know?" That, I thought, was the true advance. Once the corridor's lie was exposed, the case ceased to be a chase and became once more what Poirot liked best, a study in human use of error. Someone had not merely relied on chance. Someone had either understood or instinctively exploited the building's dishonesty. And that person, now that the phantom runner had been stripped away, must stand much nearer Mercer's body than the witnesses ever imagined. Chapter 5. The office and the ledger Mercer's office was richly furnished and meanly arranged like the mind of its owner. Everything in it suggested prosperity, control, and an appetite for display. Yet the arrangement of the room betrayed a coarser instinct. The desk was too large for the space it occupied, the leather too new, the bronze ornaments too heavy, and the safe in the corner too visible to be entirely trusted. It was the office of a man who wished every visitor to understand, before a word was spoken, that money and discomfort could both be produced there in whatever proportion he chose. The time Hercule Poirot returned to it, the body had been removed. That, I think, pleased him. He did not care for the theatrical authority of a corpse when the room itself had already begun to speak more intelligently. Inspector Hale, who still preferred a crime scene to be dramatic in a straightforward manner, seemed faintly dissatisfied by the absence. But Poirot looked at the cleared carpet and said only, "Good. The dead man has made his first statement. Let us hear what the living objects say before they are coached into silence." Nora Hensley was present, pale but steadier than before. She stood just inside the outer room, her hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles showed white beneath the skin. Bell, the porter, remained by the door. Hale watched them both with the broad official suspicion he distributed equally when finer gradations eluded him. Poirot spent a long time in Mercer's office, but not where another investigator might have begun. He did not first concern himself with the exact position of the body, nor with the shape of the wound as described by the doctor, nor even with the bronze paperweight that had clearly served as the weapon. He moved instead from object to object with deliberate quiet, as though reacquainting himself with the room's habits. The broken inkstand stood near the desk's edge, one blue-black trail of dried spill running toward the blotter, and then breaking off where some cloth or cuff had interrupted it. One chair had been overturned, not violently flung back, but knocked sideways in a movement too abrupt for comfort. The bronze paperweight, now wrapped and set aside by the police, had left a faint circular shadow in the dustless leather where it normally sat. And on the desk, more interesting than any of these, lay an account ledger open with more deliberation than accident. Poirot bent over it without touching. "Nora," he said, still looking down, "did Mercer usually leave his books open like this?" She answered at once, "No, never, not when alone, and certainly not when angry." Poirot glanced up. "How then?" "He snapped them shut," she said, "as if disciplining them. The phrase would have amused a lesser man." "Poirot?" merely nodded because it told him two useful things. Mercer's habits were indeed fastidious, and Nora Hensley observed more than she knew she observed. The ledger itself contained entries against several tenants and associates in Mercer's own bold, impatient hand. Rents overdue, terms amended, private notes of pressure to be applied later. One could almost feel the man's nature continuing in ink. There were lines concerning Pike, concerning Dr. Rusk, and concerning Jasper Reed. But near the end, where the ordinary business entries became thinner and more private memoranda appeared between them, a page had been removed, not torn roughly. Cut. The missing sheet came from that section of the book where Mercer, according to Nora, kept remarks not intended for clerks. Poirot studied the stub of paper left in the binding, then the pressure marks upon the page beneath. "This was done recently," he said. Hale moved at once. "How recently?" "Recent enough that the torn edge has not yet curled, and the impression from what lay on top still holds. Old mutilation settles, fresh mutilation sulks." The detective gave him a long look, half irritation, half respect. "And what was on the missing page?" Poirot turned one page back and then forward again. "Not formal accounts. The hand becomes looser here, more abbreviated." He was writing reminders to himself. Pressure points, I should say. Names, sums, perhaps scandals. Not the sort of paper a murderer takes for money. The sort he takes for danger. That altered the room. At once. Until then, the murder might still be read as anger, a blow delivered in quarrel, with the corridor acoustics disguising the retreat. But a missing page suggested purpose beyond temper. Someone had not merely silenced Mercer. Someone had removed what Mercer knew. Poirot asked then, in a tone almost casual, "Who had access to the office key?" Nora answered first. "Mr. Mercer had one. I had one for clerical work." "And anyone else?" Bell cleared his throat. "I hold a pass key to all offices and common rooms in emergencies." Hale turned sharply toward him. "You did not mention that last night." "I was not asked plain, sir." Bell looked offended rather than alarmed when this was said. He was a broad man in his 50s with tired shoulders, a careful moustache, and a respectful manner softened by long habit. He had served the building for 12 years, and everything in him suggested duty worn smooth by repetition. But as Poirot later remarked to me, habit is not innocence. It is only rhythm. "You, entered here yesterday?" Poirot asked him. "Only to open for cleaning before office hours, and once at Mr. Mercer's bell in the afternoon." "And at night?" "No, sir." "You are certain?" "Yes, sir." "Do you ever read what is left on his desk?" Bell's eyes rose, more hurt than angry. "No, sir." Poirot accepted that without comment. There are times when protest tells less than posture. Bell protested as a servant whose dignity had been touched, not as a thief whose secret had been threatened. Poirot next examined the floor near the desk. Because of the fresh polish, the marble had become extraordinarily sensitive to disturbance in one way and extraordinarily deceptive in another. At first glance it appeared almost blank. But when he changed his angle to the window light and crouched lower than his elegant clothes seemed willing to permit, certain marks emerged. One section showed a dull arc where the shine had been scuffed away. It did not resemble the broad, confused damage of a struggle so much as the sudden twist of a shoe turning sharply under weight. A man pivoting, perhaps, or bracing himself at the instant of shock. Nearby, almost invisible except at a very narrow angle, there was a faint semicircle impressed in the wax. Poirot remained still for some seconds. "A cane ferrule," he murmured. Naturally, that pointed at once toward Edwin Pike, who used a cane. Hale seized upon it with visible relief, like a man rescued from ambiguity by a familiar object. "There, then," he said. "Pike hears the footsteps in the wrong direction because he's making sure he's not associated with them. He argues with Mercer over rent, comes here, kills him, twists away and leaves the ferrule mark." Poirot did not immediately answer. He continued to study the floor. At last he said, "Too visible." Hale stared. "Too visible." A clue that waves its arms at one from the floor usually wishes to be admired rather than believed. The detective's mouth hardened. You think it was planted? I think it is obliging. That is not the same thing. He asked Bell then to fetch Edwin Pike's cane. When it came, Poirot compared the ferrule without touching the mark itself. The diameter was near enough, but not exact. More importantly, the angle of the impression suggested not a man leaning habitually on a cane, but a downward pressure almost theatrical in its neatness. A real support point wanders with the body. This one had been placed. So, said Poirot softly, someone either used another cane or borrowed the idea of one. That returned the case, with fresh malice, to intelligence. Nora, watching from the doorway, said in a low voice, Mr. Pike did come here yesterday afternoon. Hale turned. You're sure? Yes. He argued about the rent increase. I heard him before I was told to leave the inner room. Poirot looked up at once. And after that argument? Mr. Mercer laughed. Then he said, You may keep your principals, Pike, but they do not pay marble. That sounded exactly like Mercer. And Pike left using his cane? Yes. Did he strike it on the floor sharply? Nora frowned, thinking. He did. When angry. Ah, said Poirot. A useful habit. Easy to imitate. He then made a little experiment of his own. Taking Bell's heavier walking stick from the stand by the outer door, he pressed the ferrule down upon a clear patch of waxed marble, not once but twice changing the angle. The second impression matched the mystery mark much better than Pike's ordinary cane would have done. You see, he said to Hale, anyone wanting to recall Pike to the floor could do worse than borrow a broader stick and a little confidence. Hale rubbed his jaw and looked again at the desk, the open ledger, the missing page, and the false cane sign. Then the office wasn't only a murder scene. No, said Poirot. It was revised. That was the heart of it. Mercer's office had been left not in the disorder of violence alone, but in the tidied arrangement of someone who, after the blow, had taken one page, opened one ledger, left one impression, and trusted the lying corridor to supply a fleeing man. Anger might strike with a bronze weight. Revision required cooler blood. As Poirot moved once more around the desk, he lifted the overturned chair and set it back on its feet. Then he stood very still behind it, looking toward the door. If Mercer was seated here, he said, and his killer stood there, the first blow may have been delivered, while Mercer half rose. He turns, the chair goes over, the inkstand breaks. The killer then sees the ledger, remembers the page, removes it, and, most important, has time enough to think. Because no one enters at once, I said. Precisely. Miss Hensley hears. The quarrel hesitates. Hears what she believes are retreating steps, and the corridor grants the murderer half a minute of borrowed distance. He looked once more toward the passage. A very expensive building, Hastings. It provides its criminals with acoustical services. The case had altered again. We no longer had merely a dead extortioner and a crowd of angry debtors. We had a room that had been consciously edited after death, a missing note from Mercer's private ledger, and a clue on the floor too eager to point at a lame old schoolmaster. And that meant one thing above all. The murderer had not acted in blind fury. He had acted, then arranged. Chapter 6. The lives behind the doors. As the day stretched on, the tenants of the Blackridge building became less like a tidy row of suspects, and more like the inhabitants of the same private storm. That is one of the first lessons in any enclosed mystery worth the name. At the beginning, motive appears to sort human beings into convenient categories. This man was angry, that woman afraid, the other indebted, another humiliated. But if one looks longer, one discovers that anger, fear, debt, and humiliation have not arranged themselves in single file. They overlap, they circulate, they live in the walls. And a building such as Blackridge, with its polished passage and locked offices and expensive silences, had clearly been making a trade of them for years. Edwin Pike, for example, had indeed quarreled bitterly with Silas Mercer. Of that there was no doubt. The old schoolmaster's resentment possessed not merely heat, but history. He had inhabited his rooms long enough to regard them as part of the order of his existence, and Mercer's rent increase had struck him not as a business inconvenience, but as a moral insult. He spoke of tenancy as if it were a compact between civilization and endurance, and of Mercer as a barbarian admitted too far into both. Yet even in wrath, Pike remained what he fundamentally was, a man who wished to be acknowledged as right. Poirot interviewed him again in the late afternoon, this time not as a witness to sound, but as an inhabitant of grievance. Pike received us in his suite with an expression made defensive by principle. A volume of Tacitus lay open on the table, though I suspected he had not read a line of it since breakfast. His cane stood within easy reach, not because he needed it at every second, but because men who define themselves by habits of order always like the symbols of those habits near at hand. "You have already had my statement," he said. "Yes," said Poirot. "Now I would like your character." Pike blinked. Hale frowned. I, knowing Poirot better, merely waited. "You came yesterday to argue with Mercer," Poirot continued. "You disapproved of his methods, resented his increase, and no doubt told him so at length." "I did. You wished him defeated, certainly. You perhaps even pictured him ruined, rebuked, brought before some tribunal of decency?" At that Pike's face altered slightly, because he had indeed pictured something very like it. "I wished him checked." "Ah," said Poirot. "Checked, corrected, publicly shown to have exceeded his authority. That is quite different from a man who wishes simply to strike and have done." Pike's indignation, for once, eased into something closer to candor. "I am not a violent man." "No," said Poirot. "You are a rhetorical one. Men of your sort sometimes kill, but they prefer justice with an audience. Murder in an office and a corridor full of false footsteps is a rather vulgar method for you." Hale looked annoyed, perhaps because the observation was both charitable and accurate. Pike, I think, almost preened under it before remembering the circumstances. Thus Poirot set him aside, not as innocent in every respect, but as improbable in this one. Pike's vanity required recognition. The murderer at Blackridge had relied not on recognition, but on distortion. Dr. Calvin Rusk proved more interesting. Behind his composed manner, his good hands and his physician's quiet speech lay the unmistakable fatigue of a man walking at the edge of professional collapse. He had the look not merely of financial strain, but of moral depletion, the exhausted alertness of one who has been carrying worry for too long and no longer bothers to disguise its physical cost. His consulting room, which Poirot asked to see, told the same story. It was still neat, still medically respectable, but several small economies had crept into it. A lamp not replaced though its shade was cracked, journals months old, and on the shelf, a bottle set upside down to drain the last inch from it. Mercer, it turned out, had financed the doctor's rooms 2 years earlier, when an expansion of practice seemed likely to repay both loan and pride. The expansion had not occurred. Patients were fewer, bills were slower. Mercer, who lent assistance the way spiders lend silk, had recently begun pressing harder. "He threatened exposure," said Rusk after some resistance. "Not to the medical board exactly. He was too subtle for that. He hinted at certain prescription irregularities." "Were there irregularities?" asked Hale. Rusk gave him a long, tired look. "There are always irregularities if one examines a struggling practice with sufficient ill will. He knew that. He liked such areas. Not crime, perhaps, not innocence either. Grey places are his natural pasture." That was extremely well said. He admitted the debt. He admitted the threats. Yet what interested Poirot most was that the doctor's distress seemed directed less at Mercer's death than at the public shame likely to follow investigation. A man relieved by the removal of a blackmailer may still tremble if inquiry promises to expose the materials of blackmail anyway. Fear after a murder is not always guilt. Sometimes it is merely the continuation of dependence under a new light, Poirot. "Mark that, though not, I think, as murderous guilt." "No," he said to me later. "Rusk fears scandal more than punishment, which is characteristic of tired professional men. But his fear points forward, not backward. The murderer's mind, in this case, had time to revise. Nora Hensley was perhaps the saddest figure in the whole building, because her fear of Mercer had become muscle memory. Some people fear a bully in episodes. Nora feared him continuously, in posture, tone, anticipation, and breath. She knew the hour at which his temper typically sharpened. She knew the quality of voice he used before blackmail. She knew when he preferred privacy, when he wanted witnesses, and which expressions on his face meant not rage, but the colder pleasure of tightening a screw. Such knowledge does not come from a few dramatic incidents. It comes from years of administrative servitude under a man who uses each day as rehearsal for power. Under Poirot's patient examination, she revealed more than she had done before. Mercer, she said, kept not only ledgers and leases in his office, but copied letters, signatures, and private memoranda in a locked drawer of the cabinet behind the screen. He liked duplication. It reassured him. If a debtor wrote one appeal, Mercer copied it. If a tenant signed one note, Mercer retained two versions. If gossip arrived by telephone, he turned it into paper before dinner. He wanted everything to exist twice, Nora said. Once in the world, and once under his hand. That sentence struck Poirot deeply. And who handled these copies? He asked. I typed some. Others he wrote himself. But when he wished something delivered privately, he gave sealed envelopes to Bell the porter. Yes. Now at last, a new angle entered the case. Nora explained that Mercer often instructed Martin Bell, the night porter, to carry sealed envelopes to private addresses after hours. Sometimes the deliveries were within walking distance. Sometimes they went by cab. Bell received a small gratuity for these errands, and because porters in such buildings are assumed to exist chiefly for messages, no one had thought much of it. Did you know the contents? Poirot asked. No, but you knew the nature. Nora's eyes lowered. I knew some were respectable and some were not. How? From the Times, from the handwriting, from the care with which he sealed them, and from the expressions people wore the next day after Bell had gone out. That was enough. Bell, then, was more than a porter. He was a discreet extension of Mercer's reach. When Bell was questioned again, his calm altered by a degree too small for Hale to see and too large for Poirot to miss. He admitted the deliveries after only brief resistance. Yes, Mr. Mercer occasionally asked him to take letters out. Yes, he was paid for the trouble. No, he never opened them. No, he did not inquire into business above his station. Of course not, said Poirot. And yet you knew. Bell's broad hands, resting on his knees, tightened slightly. Knew what, sir? Which dealings were respectable and which were carrion? That was the word Poirot chose, and it landed. Bell looked up sharply, then away again. A porter sees a good many doors, he said. Yes, said Poirot, and learns what sort of people wait behind them. It was not confession, but it was proximity to truth. Bell had served the building 12 years. He knew which tenants received messages in the ordinary course of commerce and which received them after dusk, sealed too carefully, delivered too personally, and answered the next day with faces gone grey. He knew Mercer's business not in figures, but in atmosphere. It is dangerous, Poirot said afterward, to treat servants as furniture. They hear the truth while dusting around it. The phrase delighted me, though the substance of it did not. If Bell had been Mercer's courier in all that was unofficial, he might also know what private note had vanished from the ledger, who feared it, and why the false footsteps in the corridor were more useful to some than to others. Yet Poirot did not at once accuse him. That was not his way. He preferred first to enlarge the map. By evening, he had asked Hale for two things: Mercer's personal correspondence of the last fortnight and the inquiry from city records regarding Jasper Reed's contract defect. Hale, whose patience with collateral paperwork had never been enthusiastic, protested mildly. You still think Reed matters? Poirot, standing by the window of Mercer's office and looking not at the street but at the reflection of the room in the glass, answered, I think the murder is standing upon another crime, and the second one has not yet been invited in. That was typical of him, half riddle, half diagnosis, and wholly correct in instinct long before it became plain in proof. Mercer's death, brutal as it was, had already shown signs of revision. The missing ledger page, the too visible cane mark, the manufactured corridor flight. Such arrangements are rarely made for murder alone. They are made to protect something already endangered. Reed's contract, Rusk's prescriptions, Pike's rent war, Bell's deliveries, Nora's knowledge, somewhere among them, I felt, lay the secondary crime upon which the first had placed its feet. And if Poirot was right, then Mercer had died, not merely because he was hated, but because at the moment of his death he stood too near the exposure of some profitable wrong. Chapter 1. 7. The Paper That Vanished. The city records yielded what Mercer had very likely intended to exploit, and with that discovery the case seemed, for a few dangerous hours, almost too simple. Jasper Reed's renovation contract, upon examination, proved rotten in a particularly modern and expensive way. The sums had not been stolen in one brutal seizure, but thinned away through overbilling, duplicate invoices, and payments assigned to subcontractors who had either died months earlier or never existed outside paper. It was the sort of fraud that requires not boldness but patience, and is therefore often far more profitable. Someone had siphoned off a considerable amount. Mercer, who had a vulture's instinct for any financial wound that might be pecked wider, had obtained documentary proof and was pressing Reed for payment in exchange for silence. When confronted with the facts, Reed denied murder but admitted the fraud. He did so in Poirot's presence, in Hale's hearing, and with that curious mixture of resentment and relief one sometimes sees when a man is finally forced to confess the lesser of two crimes. His broad, polished face lost something then, something of the businessman's easy indignation with which he had first met suspicion. "Yes," he said, "there were false names in the accounts, some overbilling, some arrangements. I'll not pretend innocence where figures are concerned," Mercer found out. He wrote, then telephoned, then demanded immediate payment in exchange for keeping the thing out of the courts and newspapers. I came to see him because he threatened to ruin me publicly if I did not bring cash that night. Hale, who liked both, fraud and rage because they made murder sound almost commendably straightforward, looked grimly satisfied. There then. But Poirot was not satisfied at all. Indeed, the clearer Reed's motive became, the less comfortable Poirot appeared. That is always the alarming stage with him. When a case begins looking too obliging, he distrusts it at once, as another man might distrust an over-friendly witness. He questioned Reed longer and more minutely than seemed at first necessary. How much money had Mercer demanded? In what denominations? Had Reed brought it? Where was it now? What exactly had Mercer said when the interview grew heated? At what moment had Reed stood? Did Mercer open the ledger before or after the quarrel sharpened? Did Reed notice the paperweight? The contractor, for all his offence, answered reasonably enough. Yes, he had brought money, though not the full amount demanded. Yes, Mercer had laughed at the partial payment. Yes, there had been threats. Yes, Mercer had implied he possessed not merely copies but originals. And yes, Reed had left furious. But the fury, to Poirot's eye, was of the obvious and immediate kind. Reed was not patient. Reed was not subtle. Reed believed in pressure, not arrangement. If he had killed Mercer in rage, Poirot said later, he would have blundered, rushed, perhaps even shouted, and almost certainly fled in honest confusion. The office, by contrast, had not been left in the raw untidiness of rage. It had been revised. That remained the crucial distinction, the open ledger, the too convenient cane mark on the floor, the noisy confusion in the corridor, and above all the missing page. These suggested arrangement after violence, not violence alone. Someone had stayed calm enough, or become calm quickly enough, to shape the scene after Mercer fell. It is possible, I said, that Reed struck the blow and another person came in afterward and improved it. Poirot nodded. Very possible. And because it is possible, the solution must not be chosen simply because Reed has earned one. Then came the missing page again, and with it, a new direction. Nora Hensley, once she understood that Poirot was not using her statements merely to support the nearest arrest, began to remember with greater courage. That is one of the things frightened secretaries do best. They forget under authority and remember under intelligence. Mercer, she said, often kept duplicate notations of his private collections, not only the formal accounts, but smaller coded lists written near the back of the ledger or on loose sheets slipped between pages. He categorized them in his own coarse little system as paid, pending, and impossible. She had once seen those words, not in full entries perhaps, but as headings or marginal notes. Impossible, she thought, meant leverage that could not easily be turned into cash, yet remained useful for control. Pending meant active pressure. Paid required no imagination. One entry, she now remembered with growing unease, concerned Bell. At that name the room altered. Though Bell himself was not yet present to feel it, Mercer had years earlier lent money to Bell's son. The son later died, the debt unpaid. There had been forged receipts afterward, small falsifications by which Bell, desperate and ashamed, attempted to cover the matter. Mercer discovered them, retained copies, and from then onward made the porter useful. Useful first for discreet deliveries, then for quiet errands. Then, Nora believed, for something else connected with access and timing. He liked to have hold of people by old weakness, she said. It made them cheaper to manage. Hale's expression changed at once. He liked this much better than acoustics. Forged receipts, debt, blackmail, access to keys and 12 years' knowledge of the building. Here at last was a suspect the detective could feel with both hands. Poirot did not stop him, but neither did he join him. Bell was brought in again. He stood in Mercer's office with the same broad shoulders and respectful manner as before, yet some quiet internal brace had altered. One sees that sometimes, in men long used to deference, when they understand at last that the conversation is moving toward the area of life they have most carefully padded against intrusion. They do not panic. They harden. Hale began in the wrong way, as Poirot, later, remarked. You lied about the deliveries. What else are you lying about? Bell's face became blank at once. A servant who has survived years under rich men knows how to receive accusation into silence until it weakens. Poirot intervened gently. No, we begin elsewhere. Mr. Bell, did Mercer ever threaten your daughter? That was the right question. Bell's face changed with terrible simplicity. He did not deny. He did not bluster. He did not attempt one of those foolish half-protests by which smaller men only confirm the accusation. The expression simply left his eyes and was replaced by something much older, more tired, and infinitely more dangerous. The look of a man who has already pictured the worst for too long. Yes, he said. The word fell into the room like a dropped tool. His daughter was engaged to be married. Mercer, having discovered the old forged receipts connected to Bell's dead son and the quietly irregular way the books had once been adjusted, began by requiring harmless errands. Later he demanded more. Deliver this, carry that, open the office. Early. Say the lift failed when it did not. Leave certain maintenance complaints unresolved. Alter 1 or 2 access notations in the building log so that late use of private rooms appeared earlier, or not at all. Mercer knew perfectly well that Bell would obey as long as the past remained personal. But once the daughter's engagement was announced, he found a newer and more efficient lever. He said if I ever became difficult, Bell admitted, he might let the old receipts be seen where they'd make questions. My girl's young man works at a bank. Questions of that sort would ruin things before explanations began. There, then, was the full shape of the blackmail. Mercer did not merely own Bell's shame. He had extended it forward into the next. Generation Poirot asked only one thing at a time. Did Mercer mention this threat recently? Yes. How recently? This week. On the night he died? Bell hesitated. Yes. Hale stepped forward. So you admit he had you cornered? I admit he held what he held. And the missing page? Bell looked uncertain now, not in innocence, but in the way of a man trying to judge whether ignorance still protects him. Poirot said, Mr. Bell, the missing page was not about Reed alone. No reply. It likely linked Mercer's whole scheme of coercion, Reed's fraud, Rusk's debt, Pike's increase, and your own compromise service. Mercer was not a tidy blackmailer. He built archives. Bell lowered his eyes. Yes, he said at last. That sounds like him. Did you know what stood on the missing page? No, not exact. Only that he kept notes enough to ruin a dozen people if he was crossed. Did you ever see your own name there? No, but I saw him writing after certain deliveries. That, I thought, was almost worse. To know one is catalogued without knowing where or how is a very complete form of servitude. Thus the missing page was not about Reed alone. It likely connected Mercer's larger scheme of extortion, and Bell knew it well enough to fear it. That gave him motive, access, knowledge of the keys, intimate understanding of the building, and, perhaps most importantly, the sort of exhausted obedience from which violence sometimes breaks not hotly, but with dreadful calm. Hale seized on it. It was you then. Mercer threatens your daughter. Reed quarrels with him, the office is open, and you see a chance to kill him and tear out the page. Bell looked at him without expression. It was not the look of a murderer accused, nor of an innocent man shocked. It was the look of a servant hearing once more the quick certainty of those above him. Poirot, however, remained thoughtful. No, he said quietly. Not yet. Hale turned on him. What more do you need? The shape of the truth. At present we have only its weight. He then did a characteristic thing. Instead of asking Bell whether he had killed Mercer, he asked him what Mercer had him do on the evening of the murder. Bell answered that at 9:30 he was told to polish the brass on the eastern stair rail and remain off the second floor unless rung for. That instruction, trivial in itself, struck Poirot at once. A man expecting a difficult interview sends away the one building servant who knows the floor best, he said. Interesting. Bell added one more detail after a long pause. At approximately 9:45, just before the cry, he had gone back toward the stairwell because he thought he heard Mercer's bell ring twice in quick succession. When he reached the landing below, he was uncertain whether the sound had truly come from the office or had only been thrown there by the building. That, said Poirot softly, is exactly how a corridor like this begins protecting someone. He dismissed Bell then, not cleared, not accused, but left in that most agonizing of conditions, moral suspense. Afterward I said, you do think he might have done it? I think, said Poirot, that he could, but capability born of long coercion is not the same thing as final action. And the missing page? He touched the edge of the open ledger with one finger. The page matters because it connects everyone. Reed supplies money, Bell supplies access, Rusk supplies vulnerability, Pike supplies a false cane, Nora supplies knowledge, and the corridor supplies escape. Mercer built a net. If the page named its knots, then the person who removed it may have been saving not only himself, but the whole hidden system. That was more unsettling than the simpler idea of one desperate porter killing one blackmailer. For it meant the case might still be wider than the blow. Bell's knowledge had ripened into motive, yes, but whether it had ripened into murder, or whether someone wished it to seem so, remained unproved. And by then, I think, Poirot had begun to suspect that the dead man's ledger described not merely the circle of those who hated him, but the mechanism by which one of them meant to survive him. Chapter 8. The Quiet Man Under Pressure. Hercule Poirot requested one final reconstruction at dusk, at the same hour as the crime. Inspector Hale objected to what he called theatrics, though less energetically than he would have done the day before. By then, the building had taught him a certain humility. He had seen respectable witnesses contradicted by marble, false direction manufactured by a corridor, and motive multiply faster than certainty. When a detective reaches that stage, reconstruction ceases to feel theatrical and begins to seem like discipline. "All this proves only acoustics," he said. "On the contrary," replied Poirot, adjusting one glove with unnecessary care. "It proves opportunity, expectation, and the point at which one false sound became useful to." "One true mind," Hale muttered, but he permitted it. Perhaps because he had begun, in spite of himself, to suspect that the truth in Blackridge would not emerge by questioning alone. It would have to be cornered, made to hear itself repeated until one person in the corridor could no longer stand the sound of it. The second floor was cleared once more. Lamps had been lit earlier than necessary, and their electric glow fell hard upon the waxed marble, so that the passage seemed less a place of movement than a polished instrument laid out for demonstration. The doors were arranged as they had stood on the evening of the murder, so far as memory and habit agreed. Mercer's office had been tidied, though not so completely as to erase its moral disorder. The desk remained with the open ledger in place, the inkstand broken but preserved to one side, and the air still faintly haunted by leather, ink, and the cold, metallic smell that rooms of violence never wholly relinquish at once. Poirot placed each person with meticulous intelligence. Nora Hensley stood near the alcove outside the secretary's table, precisely where she would have been able to hear Mercer's raised voice without seeing the corridor clearly. Edwin Pike waited opposite the records room, his cane set beside him, his expression made prickly by both curiosity and offense. Dr. Rusk remained on the upper stair, one hand on the banister, in the position from which he had originally heard the shout through the stairwell vent. Martin Bell stood by the service closet at the eastern turn. Jasper Reed, arms folded and dignity drawn close about him like a coat, took his place near the western end. Hale remained with me near the centre. Of the corridor, Poirot entered Mercer's office alone. He shut the door. For several seconds nothing happened. The building itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, from within, came a raised voice. Not quite Mercer's, not quite any man's, but a controlled approximation of anger used only for effect. Immediately after it, a heavy crash. Then a woman's cry, sharp and involuntary enough to start even those of us prepared for it. Then two hard footfalls just outside the office door. The result was exactly what it had been before. And yet, because we now watched it knowingly, 10 times more disturbing. Pike pointed west. Nora turned east. Rusk called down from above that someone had run for the stair. Bell, I noticed, did not move at all. Reed half turned as if to follow an imagined motion that was nowhere visible. The confusion spread on cue, not because anyone was dishonest, but because the building itself seemed eager to assist the lie. Poirot stepped out, smiling faintly. "You see, the footsteps need not mean flight. They need mean only fear in the listeners." He paused, then turned his head very slightly. "And now, Mr. Bell, perhaps you will tell us why you alone, when first questioned, described not the sound of shoes on marble generally, but the sound of heels striking near the office threshold." "No, one moved." Bell stared at him. The porter's broad face, ordinarily so softened by long habit of respectful service, lost all intermediate expression. It did not pass first through shock, then denial, then anger, as many men's do. It simply emptied, and because it emptied, the whole corridor seemed to tighten about him like a noose drawn by silence. Hale looked sharply from Poirot to Bell. "What is he talking about?" Poirot did not take his eyes from the porter. "In Mr. Bell's earliest statement," he said, before the others had repeated their own certainties often enough to contaminate his, he did not say he heard footsteps racing down the corridor. He said the heels hit hard by the office and seemed to go east. That is a porter's precision. It describes origin before direction. Only later, after hearing Miss Hensley and Mr. Pike, did he allow his account to merge with theirs. Hale frowned as memory caught up with the words. "It's true," he said. "He did say that." Poirot inclined his head. He was close enough to know that the sound began at the door. A terrible stillness followed. Bell's hands trembled once and were still. Then he said in a voice so altered from its ordinary mildness that it seemed to come from some older and rougher man hidden within him for years. I did not mean to kill him. I meant to frighten him into giving back the papers. There are confessions that burst forth. This one seemed rather to fall, heavy and unavoidable, into the open space the reconstruction had made. No one in the corridor exclaimed. Even Hale did not interrupt. It was as if everyone present understood that noise now would only coarsen something already grave enough. Poirot said quietly, "Tell it exactly." Bell lowered his eyes, not in theatrical shame, but as a man looks down upon ground he knows, and no longer trusts. Mercer had me carrying letters for years. You know that much. Not only letters, lists, keys. Times when men came and went by the service way and left no proper note of it. He'd call it business. I called it filth in my own head, but that altered nothing. He had the receipts from the debt after my boy died. Then he had more besides. Little false entries he made me help with in the maintenance books. Small enough each one, but enough together to shame my daughter's marriage if they ever came. "Out," Reed said bitterly. "So he owned you too?" Bell gave him one hard glance. He owned parts of most of us. That was true enough, that no one contradicted it. Poirot said, "And the missing page?" Bell swallowed. I knew there was a page near the back with names on it. Not proper accounts, just notations, marks. He once let me see enough to frighten me. Reed's business, the doctor's debt, Pike's rent pressure, my own matter. Other things I never understood. He said if anyone crossed him, he'd only need that one page and a policeman with time. Did you go to him for it that night? Yes. Why that night? Because he threatened my daughter plain that afternoon. Said her young man ought to know what sort of stock he was marrying into. Said one whisper at the bank and all would come apart. I knew then he meant to use the papers, not just keep them. Bell looked for the first time, not merely guilty, but exhausted beyond all ordinary measure. I meant only to frighten him. I had no weapon with me when I entered. I meant only to confront him and force him to give back the papers. I waited, till Mr. Reed had gone in and come out again. Then I went to Mercer's door. He let me in because he thought I'd come on his business. Poirot asked, "Did he have the ledger open already?" "Yes." "And the page?" I saw him put one hand over it when I spoke. That, then, was the critical instant. Mercer, suspicious even in dominance, had already understood that Bell's visit was not a routine errand, but a plea or threat about something written there. "What did you say?" Poirot asked. I said he'd done enough, that he was too. Give me the receipts and that page, or I'd go to the police with what I knew of the letters and the logs and all the rest. He laughed. Said I'd hang myself before I got him into a dock. Bell's mouth tightened. Then he said my daughter might do well in a dress shop once the bank people were done with her name. Nora gave a small, involuntary sound. Pike shut. His eyes, even Hale's expression hardened into something more than official attention. He stood? Asked Poirot. Yes, fast. Quick for a big man, knocked the chair. Reached, I thought, for the bell or maybe the desk drawer. I don't know. I snatched the bronze paperweight from the desk to stop him coming at me. He caught my sleeve. We turned. I struck once. The words were not dramatic. That made them much worse. With the paperweight? Said Hale. Yes. Not the paperweight? No. He fell against the desk edge and then down. The paperweight fell from my hand and hit the floor. That was the heavy crash people heard. That explained at once one of the case's quietest. Oddities. The blow that killed Mercer had been assumed to come from the bronze lion because it bore blood. But blood transfers easily in rooms of violence. The real first strike had come from Bell's improvised weapon. The lion had become, afterward, a more plausible and more convenient murderer's emblem. Poirot asked, Did Mercer speak again? Bell's face changed. No. Did you know he was dead? No. I knew only he was down. There was blood, at his temple and under him. Then Miss Hensley cried out from the outer room. And the footsteps? Bell took one breath. I panicked. I stepped to the threshold and stamped twice hard on the marble, just as I'd heard sounds jump there before. I thought if it seemed someone had run, folks would look away from the office and I might think what to do. It was foolish, but it worked. Poirot said nothing for a moment. Then, yes, it worked. Bell continued with the dreadful momentum of a man who, once truth begins, cannot any longer bear partial measures. I snatched the page from the ledger because it named me, and more than me. Reed too, maybe. Others. I don't know who all. Then I saw Pike's old ferrule mark from earlier in the wax near the desk, or thought I did. I pressed my stick down there to make it clearer. I wanted the suspicion to go anywhere but where it was. Pike's face flamed with outrage. "You meant to hang me with my own cane," Bell said without looking at him. "I meant not to lose my daughter." And there, perhaps, lay the whole miserable moral tangle of the case. Bell had killed Mercer, in fear and desperate rage, not after weeks of design. Yet the moments after the strike had been cold enough for revision. He had created the false runner. He had taken the page. He had sharpened the cane mark. He had trusted the lying corridor, because years of service had taught him exactly how it lied. And because Mercer had indeed blackmailed and degraded so many, Bell's fear found easy shelter beneath the general confusion of motive. Hale found his voice first. "You should have come straight to us." Bell gave him a look almost of pity. "Men like me do not go straight anywhere, Inspector, not after 12 years under a man like Mercer." That answer silenced even Hale for a second. Poirot, however, had not yet finished. "The page," he said. "Where is it now?" Bell closed his eyes briefly. "In the furnace room, behind the third coal bin, wrapped in oilcloth." Hale sent a constable at once. The porter remained where he was, no longer resisting, no longer pleading. His confession had not been a bid for mercy. It had been surrender to proportion. The corridor, with all its polished deceit, seemed suddenly smaller around him. Reed said at last, "So you killed him over your daughter, and I nearly hanged for my accounts." Bell answered, "Mercer had enough in that ledger to hang half the floor." "Exactly," said Poirot. All eyes turned to him. That is why the case was difficult. Not because there were too few motives, but because there were too many. Mercer's office was a chamber of pressure. Reed supplied financial fraud. Rusk supplied medical fear. Pike supplied the convenience of a cane and public grievance. Bell supplied knowledge of the corridor, the keys, and the habits of after-hours business. The murderer stood not outside that web, but at one of its knots. Hale said, "And you knew it was Bell because of the footsteps?" "No. I knew it must be someone intimate with the building because the footsteps were manufactured so exactly, for the corridor's dishonesty. Bell's first statement told me he was closer to the office than he first allowed. The page gave him reason. Mercer's hold over his daughter gave him desperation. The rest was only waiting for him to hear his own act repeated until he could no longer bear how cleverly the corridor had assisted him." Bell gave a short, bitter sound. It always was a lying passage. "Yes," said Poirot, "but only one man in it chose to make use of the lie." The constable returned with the oilcloth packet. Inside lay the missing ledger page, creased and stained but still legible. Names, sums, marks, initials, and vicious little categories in Mercer's. Hand covered it, Reed's contract notation, Rusk's debt, Pike's arrears, Bell's receipts, complete hold. 2 other entries from outside the known circle. Enough indeed to ruin, expose, or shame several respectable lives. Hale took it with the satisfaction of a man at last granted paper to accompany blood. But Poirot's expression remained grave. For Blackridge had yielded not a masterpiece of criminal genius, but something sadder and perhaps more common, a death born from long coercion and one terrible threshold moment when a quiet man under pressure ceased to bear, struck once, and then trusted marble, fear, and other people's motives to carry him farther than he could otherwise have gone. Chapter 9. What happened in the office Bell's confession came slowly, not because he resisted, but because shame makes an honest chronology difficult. There are men who deny because they are cunning, and men who deny because they are vain. Bell belonged to a sadder class. He had told lies only after the blow, and each of those lies had been practical, frightened, and degrading. The truth, once he began to speak it, did not come to him as a single clean statement, but as a series of reluctant returns to the room in which his life had altered. He was a porter by trade, a man of habits, keys, corridors, and nightly rounds. Such men do not often narrate themselves. They endure. When endurance breaks, language comes badly. He stood in the corridor while Poirot questioned him, his broad hands hanging loose at his sides now, the strength in them seeming not useful, but almost shameful. Hale had taken out his notebook again. Pike sat rigid with outrage. Reed looked darkly vindicated and yet not comforted by it. Nora Hensley, pale near the wall, had the exhausted stillness of one who has at last heard aloud the shape of the house in which she has been serving. "Begin with Mr. Reed," said Poirot. "You waited until he had left." Bell nodded. "I knew Reed had gone in because Mercer told me to keep clear of the second floor till rung for, and that always meant private business. But I heard enough through the stairwell and passage to know it had turned bad. Raised voices, Mercer in his cutting tone, Reed coming out quick, angry. I thought then that perhaps it was my chance." "Chance for what?" "To get the papers back. Not money. Not revenge." Even then, Bell named first the thing by which Mercer had owned him. That mattered. He said he had gone to the office not like an intruder, not in his own mind, but as a father. Mercer had carried the forged receipts and the copied notes for years, first as insurance, then as amusement, and finally as threat. Bell's son, before his death, had entangled the family in debt and false promises. Bell, panicked and clumsy in his grief, had tried to cover the worst of it with altered acknowledgements and dates. Mercer had found them, preserved them, and from then onward had drawn the porter into service whenever discretion was wanted. Deliver this envelope. Open that room. Record the lift as stalled when it was not. Enter the record suite after hours, and say later it was for boiler inspection. Little acts, each survivable. Together, a trap. "And when your daughter became engaged," said Poirot, "Mercer found a fresh hold." Bell's mouth tightened. "Yes, he threatened to expose the old falsifications. Yes, and on that day, he said the bank people at the young man's office would think twice about the family if they saw what sort of paper had once passed under my hand." Even Hale, who had little patience for sentiment in statements, looked grim at that. Bell had gone, therefore, to Mercer's office by passkey, but not secretly. Mercer knew he was there. That was another important distinction. Had Bell crept in unannounced, the murder would belong more to plan than to pressure. Instead, he entered the room as an extorted subordinate, making one final plea. He looked at me, Bell said, as if I were a stain that had begun speaking. "What did you ask for?" Poirot said. "The receipts, the copies, anything with my name or the boys. I said I'd had enough. I said if he meant to ruin my girl, then he might as well ruin me openly and be done. And Mercer?" Bell gave a tired, terrible little smile. He laughed. The simplicity of that made it more convincing than any embroidered recollection could have done. One could hear Mercer's laugh in the room even then, coarse with confidence, pleased at the sight of fear made articulate. He said, "Bell," continued, "that decent girls recovered from broken engagements, but dishonesty in a family had a longer life. Then he said my son had not been worth the first pound lent to him, and that the dead were a poor investment unless one could squeeze the living." No one spoke. That, I think, was the moment at which Bell ceased in his own mind to be merely blackmailed, and became, if only for seconds, a man past bearing. "Mercer," he said, half rose from behind the desk while speaking, one hand already coming down over the open ledger as if to cover the page Bell had seen. Bell knew at once that his own name was there, and perhaps the daughter's danger with it. Mercer moved, Bell moved. The chair skidded, and in that compressed, violent confusion, Bell seized the bronze paperweight from the desk and struck once. 1. Blow, said Hale. 1. With intention to kill? Bell shut his eyes for a second. With intention to stop him. It was a miserable answer, and probably the truest available. Men in such moments rarely know whether they mean death or silence. They discover only afterward which they have chosen. Mercer fell almost at once. His head struck the edge of the desk or floor, Bell could not say which, and there was blood. That part he remembered less clearly than the laugh before it. He stood, he said, unable for a second to understand that the room had changed from threat to aftermath. Then he heard movement beyond the office door. Miss Hensley in the outer room. A stir in the corridor. The ordinary life of the building continuing toward disaster. It was then, said Poirot quietly, that panic became strategy. Bell looked at him with bleak gratitude, as if thankful that another mind had found the right shape for what he himself could only feel. Yes. Those few seconds, more than the blow, revealed the method of the case. Bell saw the open ledger. He saw, or thought he saw, enough of the missing page to know his own ruin lived there in Mercer's hand. He tore it out. But the ledger could not simply be closed. A closed book suggests completion. An open one suggests interruption, quarrel, discovery. So he left it as it lay. Then, stepping toward the threshold, he saw upon the wax outside the desk area one of Pike's earlier marks. The schoolmaster had indeed visited Mercer that evening, cane striking and dragging more sharply than usual in anger. Bell, knowing that habit, understood what it might offer. There was no real feral mark sufficient to accuse, so he enlarged the suggestion. With what? Asked Hale. A coat hook from the stand in the outer room, and the edge of my shoe, after. That was the final indignity, not only murder, but imitation. Bell had taken the vocabulary of another man's habit and written it larger on the floor. And the footsteps? Poirot said. Bell gave a small, exhausted shrug. I stamped twice. Hard, near the threshold. I'd heard before how the corridor. Through sound after polishing. Men coming back late would seem to be farther off than they were. Bells rang queer. Steps went east or west, depending where you stood. I thought if there was running for them to hear, they would not think first of Vi, the man still by the door. It worked, said Poirot. Yes. Worked better than Bell had dreamed. By the time Nora Hensley screamed, the building had already improved upon his clumsy little fraud. The corridor, eager to collaborate, had invented a retreating fugitive. From 2 hard impacts and a frightened room's imagination. East, west, lift, stair. Every witness added architecture to panic and called it memory. Hale asked, "But why remain?" Bell looked at him steadily then, and there was in the look something beyond guilt, something like final contempt for the blindness of easier men. "Because a porter is always there," he said. "If I ran, I became visible. If I stayed, I became part of the building." There, in one sentence, lay the whole method. Blackridge had hidden him not by darkness, but by familiarity. Bell belonged in corridors, at thresholds, near desks, by service closets, under bells, beside doors. People looked past him as they looked past banisters, rugs, and umbrella stands. A fleeing stranger would have become a person at once. A porter, remaining where a porter was expected, became part of the architecture the moment after the crime. Poirot understood this perfectly. I think he had understood some version of it before Bell ever spoke. Yes, he said. That is the true use of the corridor. Not merely that it lied about direction, but that it made the stationary man invisible by giving everyone a moving one to imagine. Bell's head lowered a little, not in relief, only because the worst had now been said. What followed was not exculpation, nor precisely condemnation. Hale, once the confession had settled into note and sequence, resumed the sober mechanical duties of his office. The missing ledger page was compared, the positions marked, the outer room coat stand examined for the absent hook, the bronze paperweight matched to Bell's account of the blow. Blood, wax, and timing now aligned. The case, which had seemed so complicated in echo, became in act almost brutally simple, yet morally it did not simplify. Bell had killed Mercer. That was plain, but he had killed him under years of coercion and under a threat not to himself only, but to his daughter's future. He had then turned frightened cunning upon the room, the ledger, Pike's cane habit, and the polished marble. Passage. It was murder, yes. It was also the final desperate strike of a quiet man who had been made useful too long and had suddenly seen all ordinary exits closed. As Poirot later said to me, when the corridor had emptied, and only the damp shine of the lamps remained on the marble. The tragedy of such men, Hastings, is this: they endure until they no longer can, and when they act at last, everyone calls the action sudden. It is not sudden. It is only the first visible second of a pressure that has existed for years. Aymon Sancho thought of Bell then, standing by the service closet where he had so often waited for bells, envelopes, petty instructions, and midnight errands. He had indeed become part of the building. Mercer knew it. The tenants knew it. The police had nearly known it too. And because he was part of the building, he had almost succeeded in using the building's own lie to remain unseen even after the blow. But the corridor, for all its dishonesty, had betrayed him in one essential way. It had lied too broadly for the truth to remain comfortable. Chapter 10. The marble corridor speaks plainly. The arrest was made without struggle. Martin Bell did not protest, plead, or attempt the dignity of partial denial. Indeed, once Inspector Hale had finished the necessary formalities and the constable stepped forward, Bell seemed to lose not courage, but burden. It was the terrible relief of a man who has been carrying guilt in a posture too long and finds, when at last commanded to lay it down, that the body obeys before the mind is ready. He gave over the missing ledger page, the weighted stick from the service closet, and the passkey with the same exhausted obedience by which he had served the building for 12 years. It struck me then that Mercer had ruled by making other men instruments, and Bell had committed murder only when, for one fatal instant, he tried to use the same method back again. Nora Hensley wept. Not for Mercer, I think. Whatever loyalty she had once felt toward him had long ago been thinned into fear, routine, and the professional reflex by which secretaries continue serving men they inwardly despise because the next week's wages still depends upon it. No. She wept for the whole building, for the stain coercion leaves in every room it has occupied. She had typed Mercer's threats, copied his private notes, watched him tighten and release pressure on people like a man playing with screws. Bell's confession did not merely explain the death. It also revealed how many human lives had been bent, quietly and daily, under Mercer's hand. Jasper Reed faced separate charges of fraud and submitted to them with deeply injured composure. Men of his kind often imagine that if they are not guilty of the worst thing in the room, then the lesser thing should be spoken of kindly. It was not spoken of kindly. His overbilling, his dead subcontractors on paper, and his elegant thefts in figures were now fully exposed, and though he had not killed Mercer, he had helped build the climate in which Mercer's blackmail flourished. He left Blackridge not as a murderer, but as something only slightly more respectable. Dr. Calvin Rusk, though disgraced by debt, weakness, and the professional compromises on which Mercer had fed, was no killer. That truth gave him little visible comfort. Some men are acquitted and feel lighter. Rusk looked, if anything, older. A creditor's death does not erase the habits of collapse that creditor once exploited. Still, he was free of the one accusation. He could not have survived inwardly. That mattered. Edwin Pike received the vindication he had so loudly desired and discovered, to his annoyance, that it tasted less dramatic than expected. He had long imagined, I think, the moral scene in which his enemies were corrected, his perceptions admired, and his grievances shown at last to have been not crankiness, but prophecy. Instead, he had been mistaken about the corridor, nearly framed by a false cane sign, and forced to accept that his real triumph in the matter lay chiefly in having been spared injustice rather than granted glory. Such outcomes are always bitter. to the vainly upright. Yet by the time the building had quieted, even Pike seemed dimly to understand that not every rescue from false suspicion arrives accompanied by applause. Later that night, after the police had gone, the tenants had withdrawn, and the second floor had emptied into silence. I stood once more with Hercule Poirot in the marble corridor. The floor reflected the lamps in long, pale bands, and the place seemed innocent. Again, as places always do once the human urgency has been carried out of them. The office door stood shut. The western lift gate was closed. The east stair descended in shadow. Nothing moved. Yet I had learned, more clearly than in many bloodier cases, that architecture may participate in crime as readily as any witness through echo, through concealment, through the vanity of surfaces, and through the strange confidence people place in whatever sounds decisive. Poirot stood with his hands behind his back and looked the full length of the passage. Most murders, he said, depend upon some ordinary faith. In this case, in hearing. He turned his head a little. People believe sound tells them where truth is moving. A footstep, a door, a cry, a fall. They hear these things, and at once they supply direction, intention, sequence. But sound is like rumor. It grows more certain, as it travels, and less accurate. By the time three respectable people have heard the same thing differently, they are prepared to swear not only that it happened, but that it flatters their own powers of perception. I looked down the corridor, remembering how quickly all of us, myself included, had accepted the existence of a fleeing man merely because the building had offered one to the ear. "And Bell?" I asked. Poirot was silent a moment before answering. He was not born a killer, he said. He was made desperate by long humiliation, then clever by sudden fear. That is how many crimes occur. Not from villainy alone, but from the instant when a crushed man sees one narrow path and takes it. There was no softness in the judgment, only proportion. Poirot never excused murder. But he despised, perhaps more than murder itself, the lazy habit of treating all killers as if they sprang fully formed from the same mold. Bell had not the imagination for an elegant crime, and not the appetite for a predatory one. He had years of obedience, private shame, a dead son, a threatened daughter, and a blackmailer who mistook patience for permanent submission. The blow in Mercer's office was one man's act. The road to it had been built by another. That does not acquit him, I said. No, said Poirot. It only explains why the law must punish one death, while intelligence remembers two victims. Mercer? Poirot gave a slight cold shake of the head. No. Bell before the blow. That was very like him, severe without being coarse, exact without becoming sentimental. He would not beautify the porter's crime, but neither would he allow Mercer's long corruption to vanish beneath the neatness of a conviction. We walked a little way toward the eastern stair, our footsteps returning to us in softened doubles from the marble. You noticed Bell from the beginning? I asked. Not Bell as murderer. Bell as architecture. I must have looked puzzled, for he continued. He belonged too perfectly. Porters, secretaries, liftmen, housekeepers. These are the people great buildings teach others not to see. Their presence becomes part of the furnishings. That is why Bell's final method was so intelligent, though born in panic. He understood that if he ran, he became a man. If he stayed, he remained an element of the building. And once the corridor supplied a phantom fugitive, everyone looked for the moving figure and not the familiar one. I thought of Bell standing near the service closet, broad, respectful, unremarkable, while the witnesses spoke of east, west, and stairs. Yes, that had been the true concealment. Not darkness, not disguise, familiarity. And the corridor? I said. You speak of it, as if it chose sides. Poirot smiled faintly. Not chose. Offered. The corridor offered confusion, and Bell accepted. That is all. Physical facts have no morality. A polished floor, an arched ceiling, a stairwell shaft, a waxed surface. They do not lie by themselves. They merely distort faithfully. Human beings provide the false conclusion. That sentence remained with me. The marble corridor kept its own counsel after that. Buildings always do. By daylight, I have no doubt, Blackridge resumed the look of administrative respectability. Letters delivered, rents noted, lift gates opened and shut, and the traces of violence reduced once more to gossip and memory. Yet if one walked there alone at night, one could not help remembering how readily polished surfaces return not the world as it is, but the world as one expects to hear it. And in that memory lay the true solution of the case. Not merely who killed Silas Mercer, but how panic, echo, and assumption combined to lend murder the footsteps of a ghost. That, to my mind, was what made the case remarkable. The killer had not truly fled the corridor at all. He had only persuaded the corridor to flee for him.
Thanks for you watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe the Beetle channels.